Hi, everyone. This is Bill Nesper from the League of American Bicyclists. At the National Bike Summit, we were fortunate enough to have Melissa and Chris Bruntlett take us on a tour of Delft in the Netherlands. It was a great session, and we had a ton of unanswered questions from Melissa and Chris. So they were kind enough to join us again today to get to those, have a conversation about the tour and the broader applications maybe to the US from what we saw. Big thanks again to the Embassy of the Netherlands here in the US for the support of this, and also to the Dutch Cycling Embassy and Mobycon for making this possible. So thanks, and thanks to you for being here, Melissa and Chris. I'll just get to the questions. Starting off, we had a lot of questions about changing motorist behavior towards prioritizing bicyclists and pedestrians. What are some examples? You talked about forgiveness in design. What are some examples in the Netherlands that we could help create better interactions and somehow build that forgiveness into our design? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think lots, but I think one of the things, and we try, it's hard in the tour to get the full picture of it unless you're experiencing it in person, but we went through a number of intersections, and I think the protected intersection design in the Netherlands is sort of this really great example of where that forgiveness is really designed right into how bikes and pedestrians and motorists all interact, in as much as it's not like the thought of like how much space people need to be able to react if for whatever you have this lapse of judgment or are distracted for a moment. There's this space built in that provides time for motorists to react, for cyclists to react. So things like the turning radius when a car is turning right, by the time they reach where the cyclist or the bike lane crosses, they're almost perpendicular. So it's not like they're looking ahead, they're actually looking directly in front of them as to what could be there. And even beyond that, then you have the pedestrians. So not only is there this extra turning space for people to have that time to be able to stop and see what's in front of them when it comes to bikes, but then if there's a pedestrian there that they don't see at first glance, there's that extra 2.5 meters or 4 feet or so of reaction time before the most vulnerable road user has that interaction with the vehicle. And so like that's just one of many things in the protected intersection design that really stands out as building forgiveness right into the way people use the space, because we're human and we all make mistakes, and so the design needs to be able to allow for that.
I want to be careful not to spend too much time talking about driver behavior, because to me it's maybe a bit of a myth that drivers are better behaved here in the Netherlands. Of course, everyone virtually rides a bike, so there is a built-in empathy, and there is a component to the driver education that forces them to look out for cyclists, and the limited liability laws too mean that a driver is almost always deemed at fault in a collision with a more vulnerable road user. But we've seen studies that drivers here, in terms of their following the rules and texting and driving and drink driving, they're all comparable to other first world countries. The drivers here are just as bad as they are anywhere else, to put it bluntly. But it is that forgiveness that's built into the streets that minimizes the damage of that erratic behavior, that unpredictable behavior. And so there are, as Melissa just talking about, the protected intersection, the way that the local streets are designed, the buffers that are provided, the turning radii, the forcing them to slow down, pay attention, and ambiguity is a powerful tool in terms of forcing the driver to raise their awareness, really focus on what the task at hand, which is driving this 3,000-pound bit of machinery that can do a lot of damage. And as a result, there is an implicit safety that occurs here, but it's certainly not perfect. And the idea that there's this harmonious relationship with drivers and cyclists may be, again, a bit of a misnomer, because in our experience, it hasn't been true. It all comes down to engineering.
Yeah, I'm guilty of that too. I have to admit that when I'm thinking of the Netherlands and the pictures you see, you're missing some of it. And I think in your video, you see, I think I even saw like a really big like pickup truck. And I was like, that is a surprise. You had to stop the video and look at it, and it's wow. Okay, so there are a lot of the same. There are cars, there are drivers, there are people there who are operating various vehicles, and you've prioritized the safety. The Dutch have prioritized the safety of the most vulnerable users in that system. I think the principles. Two things came out of what you were just talking about, like the principles. You talked a little bit about it, but there's these principles in the design that that I think it might be good to just sort of go through those. I think there's like 5 of them, maybe 6 of them, principles that you talked about. Just like really quickly go through them, just so people can hear them again. I know that on the video we didn't go into this, but I think it's important for advocates, I think, to know what those principles are, and then maybe they can dig deeper and go into maybe they'll even get the Chrome manual, or but I think or look at your materials at the Cycling Embassy. But could you go through those principles and just the basics of what
I don't know them off by heart.
I-
You know them off by heart.
Okay, so let's start with directness, which is pretty self-explanatory, that cyclists should get the most direct route from A to B instead of this roundabout kind of meandering
Yeah.
path that we tend to give them. So the rule of thumb in the Pro manual is no more than 1.2 or 20% more than the distance as the crow flies, because cycling requires effort, and that effort should be minimized in order for cycling to be time competitive with other forms of transport. The most direct route should be provided.
Yeah, I think it builds on that idea that we as humans, no matter where we live in the world, we're pragmatic in our mobility choices. And so if you make the route direct and comfortable, then that's the route they're going to take. If they can do it by bike, even better.
Cohesion, which is more looking at the network level, that you can access all the potential origins and destinations in your city, and that there are no weak links in your network. So particularly junctions, intersections, crossings, but also
School zones are a big one, making sure that your neighborhoods are connected and calmed in a way that encourages cycling to schools and community centers, obviously local retail hubs. Making sure that there's no, for example, in North America, we talk so much about encouraging cycling to school and creating safe routes to school, but there's this gap in terms of the encouragement and the actual infrastructure that gets them there, because one can't exist without the other.
Right. Safety, again, pretty self-explanatory, but this idea that people don't want to die or get seriously injured on their way to wherever they're going, and this again sounds ridiculous, but far too often people on bikes are expected to take their well-being, their livelihood and their safety into their own hands, and that doesn't just account for road safety, but it also means social safety. So things like lighting and visibility to other road users, housing and commercial areas. These are all part of this comprehensive approach to, the next one?
No.
Comfort. I've listed these off one too many times. So I think comfort just takes the safety principle to the next level. It's reducing the stresses. You may not be putting your life in danger in certain circumstances, but minimizing the stress, the noise, the exhaust fumes, the
smoothness of the asphalt, even in certain spaces. The more comfortable it is to use, the more likely it is it will get used.
And then the fifth one is attractiveness, which is perhaps the most subjective and nice to have, but this idea that cyclists also would like nice things to look at, tree coverage,
We've even heard colleagues refer to like just keeping the roads clean, like just that little, when we think about where cycle lanes exist on the road, they're usually on the side. And so keeping that space clear of garbage and clutter and leaves and everything that would make it less attractive, and then ultimately also less safe.
And I think that, I mean, the Netherlands is in this privileged position where attractiveness is now where they're focusing a lot of their efforts. So it's about, you know, prettying up some of the underpasses and tunnels with street art, and you know, because people will go out of their way to choose routes that are more aesthetically pleasing. They may be waterfront routes or the like. But I mean, I think those are perhaps in the order of priority. With well, safety should probably be the first, but
Yeah.
but cohesion, directness, it's all this package deal of getting mainstreaming cycling for transportation rather than kind of this niche activity that's done for recreation, and then amongst the really hardcore cyclists.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful to hear those things, and it's important. They might just seem like, you know, I don't know, basic to go through them, but it's very very important. I think that we saw some of this came up in the questions where, you know, Delft was a very, it's maybe not as dense as like the bigger cities in the Netherlands, but it's also not suburban, you know, and I think I know most Americans live in the suburban areas, or at least in suburban land use. And I think you see some of that. You said some 80% are local streets, I believe. So you see some of the applicability of what things within Delft, of course, like that could work in many cities in the US. But I wondered, like, how are these principles applied in rural or more suburban places where, you know, you have, I'm assuming that you have places where people are more spread out. And so can you tell us a little bit about the applications of these principles to those sorts of settings?
Yeah, I think, well, one of the reasons that we chose to travel through Den Hoorn on the tour was because it is a little bit more of that more suburban context. You've got, albeit we don't have a lot of really single family homes. They're usually more like they are still single family homes, but they're more like row houses or semi-detached. But that at the end of the tour, that is more of that suburban context. But I think a really good example, if people are willing to do a little research, is the town of Houten, which is near Utrecht. And their entire planning process is about making cycling and walking convenient and easy. And so you have, like we mentioned in the beginning when we were going through some of the historical background and around network planning, is this idea of making driving inconvenient. So you can drive, but the purpose of getting in your car and traveling somewhere is something more long distance, not about going shopping per se or going from neighborhood to neighborhood. So it's really eliminating a lot of that through traffic, but at the early stages, at the planning stages. So I think of, you know, new developments in North America, it's this perfect opportunity to apply traffic calm streets and reduce the ability for through traffic for cars. So I know we all hate a cul-de-sac or a crescent or however we want to call them, but those do eliminate, you know, the speeding cars through a neighborhood and limit that to the people that live there or are visiting there. And then when it comes to bikes, then you start thinking about making it more convenient, making pathways to get from one side of the neighborhood to the other quickly and easily and comfortably. So I think Houghton's a really good example of that, where you've got the older parts and then also newer developments, all designed around this idea that walking and cycling should be easy and convenient. And then driving is when you have to, you can do it, but it's not meant to be going through each neighborhood to get to where you need to go.
It's a great, my mind went straight to Houghton as well, because I think they call it a cauliflower community, which is like this kind of idea of dead ends and cul-de-sacs for cars. But then at those dead ends, they have these kind of sneaky routes for people on bike and foot to get from dead end to dead end through. So people on foot and bike can move freely in every direction within the city, but the cars are immediately pushed to the perimeter ring road on this hierarchy of streets, so that driving becomes indirect and inconvenient. And you don't need dedicated cycle tracks in that context, because the traffic is calmed and reduced by the design of the roads. And this is a master plan community that was built in the 1980s, I think. So relatively new development, but with a very specific plan to make walking and cycling the default mode for almost everyone that lives there.
as it so happens, some of my colleagues did do a study tour of Houghton for Mobycon. So if people check out our YouTube, they can find that video too.
Oh, awesome. That's perfect. Yeah, that sounds, I mean, that principle seems, the principle of like, hey, you know, cars aren't going to cut through my neighborhood. And I, you know, people who are riding bikes and walking feel that, like you said, this sneaky, or like there's a way to get through and you feel like, oh, wow, I did something really cool. I know folks say that like in the US when there's, oh, they put this cut through between these two cul-de-sacs for me. And we just, boop, you know, it's really easy and it's made it, it's like win-win. It seems like that would be probably part of the way that you can generate political will, you know, to get these things done. You know, how is there a story behind the development of that political will to get those? I don't know, the way that your road classifications go seem to me to be, you know, different, just different than the US. I mean, you have big arterial streets, you have collectors, but the way you do the local roads is just different. And the question did come up, you know, what is it? What is that, like a recent switch, like to like a place like Delft to, you know, how do you cut off, you know, non-neighborhood traffic? You know, I know it seems probably pretty basic to you, but I think to like the local bike advocate, you know, who's going, hey, I want that here. I want, you know, and also the question came up, do you have sharrows on those streets? And do you have sharrows at all in the Netherlands? So two questions. Yeah.
I don't think there's sharrows anywhere. I don't know.
Are there markings? Are there markings on those low speed local roads, like, you know, to move people through, or is it just
So more,
clear
I mean,
space?
more of a recent development in the Netherlands has been this Fietsstraat or bicycle priority street, where they roll out the red asphalt, put branding and signage up, and the car is essentially aghast for that stretch. But this is this is kind of on the back of 50 years of prioritizing cycling for transport. It's not something we would recommend cities do as a first step. This is kind of the back end of your progress as a cycling city. The political will is the biggest question we get, I think, and always, where do you start? How do you change the conversation? How do you get convince politicians that this is worth the headaches and the hassle and the battles and the rhetoric and the death threats in some cases? I mean, but this all happened in the Netherlands in the 1970s. There were businesses out ripping up cycle tracks on the street. There were people rioting over they're protesting the proposed motorways that were taking place, and politicians that implemented some of these low traffic ideas were the subject of death threats and really nasty rhetoric, and they, to their credit, stuck through it. They pushed through it. They understood they had this silent majority, this kind of 60 to 70% that were behind them, and saw through to the other side. But it's I don't know if you get from A to B without that street fight, if you will, that is almost inevitable once you start removing privileges from a mode of transport that has been privileged for so many decades.
But I think I think it's important for, well, everywhere, but it's specifically for North Americans to recognize that a lot of these political battles have and are continuing to happen. So, you know, Chris offhandedly said street fight, but you think of New York City, it was just a matter of some political will and willingness to just try a few things out. And now Times Square has changed and other neighborhoods have changed. There's more and more bike lanes in the city. You know, I think now in the last year with COVID, the number of community streets that were turned into low traffic streets to encourage more active physical activity during COVID, you know, these are all examples of this is now we're trying out things and we're seeing that it works, and that helps to change the mindset. And now the job of advocates is to capture that and keep building upon that. So, you know, that often, like, these trials for these low traffic streets are the proof to politicians that this is what we can do. We can still move around. We can still enjoy, you know, relative comfort in terms of driving around our city at the same time as we're creating these more people-friendly spaces. So, you know, I know often we hold the Netherlands up as this like shining example, but it is happening in the US, and it's a matter now of really, you know, capitalizing on what's been happening and really push forward.
To maybe directly answer your initial question about the road hierarchy and the policy, that was, and this cannot be emphasized enough, that the sustainable safety national road safety policy was passed in 1998. So that's how recently it happened. And the vast majority of changes you see on Dutch streets have happened since then. So half of their 37,000 kilometers of segregated cycle lanes have been built since 1998. So it can happen in 23, 20, you know, in a generation, as long as you have that guidebook at the national level telling you this is what we should be doing as a country. This is how we should be designing our streets and prioritizing safety over speed, and getting buy-in from the vast majority of the cities. Things can change that quickly, and this is a message that we keep coming back to. It doesn't take 50, 60 years. It can be done in half that time or quicker.
Yeah, and it's funny to be in this sort of this world. Like 23 years seems like a really short time, right? It's like it's like like just to the public, you tell them, hey, in 20 years, you know, it's going to be amazing. I think, you know, it's. But you're right. I mean, that is just such a blip in the sort of timelines that we talk about in getting things done in communities. You know, unless I think you're right. There are some really great examples in the U.S. and Canada. You know, just in North America as a whole, actually, in South America too, and all around the world, of things moving forward. I think, you know, a lot of folks are not knowing where to start, and I think a lot of times it's you know, it's something big to bite off an entire network, and then you're pointing at the Netherlands, or in the domestic sense you're pointing at Portland, or you're pointing at another New York. So, you know, where to start is really tough. So that's helpful. And I think that one of the things that like folks wanted to know, it kept coming up, is just, okay, so when people are riding all the time, you know, so that you have people biking and walking and it's all going great, in that sort of intermediate period, you know, how do you work with the mixing of you've made something that's very attractive and people want to use it. Like, you know, what about these overflowing bike lanes? I just got an email the other day where, like, there's so many people walking here and there's so many people biking in this place. Are there any good examples of like how to mix them together? So, you know, like, you know, I know it's context, and I can hear, you know, it's context. I can almost hear, you know, get ready to say that. But you know, just are there any sort of general principles that you can help us with that sort of, you know, which might be a successful portion of a network that becomes very, very busy? You know, how do the Dutch handle like the mixing of pedestrians and bicyclists?
I think it's an ongoing conversation for sure.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things that at least my colleagues have been working on with the ANWB, which is like the AAA here in the Netherlands, is developing what is called in Dutch the Verkeer van de Stad, but in English we've translated that to the good street, because that's what we're trying to create. And within that, there's these hierarchies of modes. And so what we do is we look at the mass of the mode. So that could be people, that could be bikes, that could be e-bikes, cars, so on and so forth, and how fast they move, and therefore, you know, how much kinetic energy, it's getting a bit into the weeds, but how much kinetic energy they create, and therefore what the increased danger is when we're talking about mixing. And then from there, you can start to look at a street and say, okay, what do we want? What is the activity of this street? What is the purpose of it? So like context, of course. And how do we want people to move in it? Or do we want them to mix? Well, in that case, then we need to prioritize and design for pedestrians, because they're the ones that are the most vulnerable. And then you build out from there. So how do we mix pedestrians with bikes? Well, bikes have to move at a much slower pace. They have to yield to pedestrians. Can we then mix in cars? It gets a bit, you know, then we start thinking that's a much faster, heavier moving vehicle. So mixing might not make sense. And then you just keep going from there. And so that's how you get into the road hierarchies as well. Mixing on a very fast moving street, bikes and cars in the same space is just not safe. And so that's why when you have arterial roads, you have the separated facilities. And then because mostly those are used for commuters and you've got people moving quite fast on bikes, then you have the pedestrians separate as well. So it's a good way to at least start to, again, look at the context of the street.
I mean, we didn't,
but yeah,
for our tour, we didn't go anywhere near the center of Delft for strategic reasons, because it's a medieval center, it's canals, bridges, cobblestones, and the like. But we perhaps should do a future tour there, because it's almost completely car free. And the thing is, once the pedestrians and cyclists aren't fighting for scraps on the side of the road, they can coexist quite peacefully. And there's no cycling infrastructure whatsoever in the city center, but you see all kinds of cycle traffic coexisting with pedestrian traffic. We walk in the city center more often than we cycle ourselves, and it just works because people are respectful, people make eye contact, people read each other's body language, you know where they're going, and without that threat of automobile traffic, it does work, because people aren't stressed out and they're not, like I said, they've got plenty of room to maneuver around each other. But as Melissa said, as you start introducing different vehicles, we've got electric bikes now, we've got cargo bikes now that are delivering freight or what have you. We've got kick scooters, hoverboards, and all these other vehicles that are complicating things. And to us, that's just making this argument for more and more space and ending this monopoly on public space that the private automobile has.
I think one of the things, just to add on that as a last thought, is that even though a lot of these spaces, in the city center, for example, are mostly shared, there is the opportunity for adaptation as well. So we saw throughout the pandemic, with more and more people getting out on bike and on foot, certain spaces just weren't conducive to mixing anymore. And so signs went up and notices went out to people in education that certain spaces were now dominated by pedestrians. So if you're on a bike, you are to get off unless there's nobody there. So the idea was to respect the people that are moving slower in these spaces.
That was interesting. So they took the concept of the bicycle street and they made it a voetgang or pedestrian street, where the bicyclists were guests and were asked to dismount if the volumes of pedestrian traffic were high enough. And it worked surprisingly well. But again, it's mostly in context specific, in situations where you maybe don't have that through traffic. Everybody on that street is shopping or living on that street, and so they're not trying to race through. And it's not certainly a kind of a one-size-fits-all solution.
Well, and I think, similarly in Vancouver, the seawall where we used to normally bike, that the actual seawall itself became pedestrian only during the pandemic, and cyclists were forced to use the road, and cars were taken out for a period to allow for that safe space, because once those numbers increase, it becomes harder to maintain safe distances from people. And it was just an adaptation to meet the needs. Hopefully becomes a little more of a permanent idea at some point. Go Vancouver.
Yeah, right. The context changes, and these principles are reapplied. That's just great. And Go Vancouver, I had an opportunity to ride there a few years back and saw, a lot of things that could be applied to other North American cities. So good job, you and all of your teammates back there who made that possible. You talked about getting the word out about like this change, and sort of the education and that, I don't know, more the education side of the Netherlands has come up a few times. So could you tell us a little bit about bicycling education in the Netherlands? Like how do people learn about bicycling? So I know it's, you could tell us a little bit about the school system, but what about like newcomers, visitors, how do you make sure that they know how to get around by bike in the way that you do?
It's a shame our son's not home from school yet, otherwise we'd get you to tell.
Oh man, yeah, that would be some other time. That'd be great.
Our 12-year-old is in his last year of elementary school, and that's when they do an intensive year of traffic education. So they have a 15 minutes in class every week, not just specific on cycling, but on general traffic safety, the signs, the road markings, what's the best practice and isn't. And then at the end of the year, we're waiting to see if it's going to be possible due to COVID. They do a practical cycling exam on the streets of the city that they live, which is monitored and graded by the parents. They have to show that they're able to function in actual traffic situations. And then at the end of the test, they all get a nice certificate, and they're ready to go on to high school, when is generally expected that they will start cycling to and from school on their own, versus, in elementary school, it's usually done perhaps with mom or dad. So that's the start of the cycling education, but it's obviously an ongoing process. And as people come from other countries, other cultures that may not be as used to cycling, and it's not just migrant or Middle Eastern countries or African countries, it's also America or Canada. They may not also be used to cycling, but that's an ongoing process as well in terms of engaging those people.
There's actually a really interesting program they started running at the university here in Delft, TU Delft, where they offered cycling education, just like a little mini session over the course of several weeks, with not just employees of the university that are coming from other places, but also their partners or family members. And so it's literally just like, an hour or two in classroom talking about the various signs that they might not be used to seeing. And then they go out on a bike with a couple of more experienced educators that take them through what it's like to travel around in Delft on a bike. And so I've got some colleagues that have done that, and it's a mix. It's people from the US, it's people from elsewhere in Europe, people from Asia, who are not as used to getting around in a country where everyone goes by bike. And so, there's these opportunities for lifelong learning. And then there's also a national program to help seniors keep cycling well into old age, and looking at, how do we train seniors to be safe on a bike and comfortable in terms of their balance and their strength? What can they adapt for? And so, there's just this really lifelong process and reminder of what it takes to cycle. Not that it takes, once we get going, it is as easy as riding a bike, but, understanding that how we move changes, or where we are living changes. And so providing educational opportunities. I think it's just one thing that's really important to note. And I think there's this misunderstanding. The cycling education in schools isn't mandatory, so not everybody gets it in the country, but most kids do experience this. And so even though it's not reaching everywhere, it is, something that a lot of people are quite aware of, and obviously encouraging.
Yeah. What about, driver education too? So, I would imagine, I think everything we do in biking education, at the league, around the country, they're learning a lot of just general traffic safety principles. But driver education isn't so great in the US. It's especially as it relates to biking. And clearly there's more to do there, and it's at the state level oftentimes. But what is driver education like in the Netherlands? Is this part of overall mobility educate? How does it connect with the biking education?
That's a really good question that we don't necessarily have an answer.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, you're not there yet, right? 12. We'll see next.
Part of what it was is so for whatever reason, the province that we moved from in Canada doesn't have a reciprocal relationship with the Dutch government, so we weren't able to transfer our licenses. But we do understand that when we travel to other places, we'll probably need to drive again. And from what we've been hearing, it's a very intensive process. It's also very expensive. I would imagine there's lots of cycling related information within how to navigate the streets.
I would assume so. Yeah.
And a very basic understanding, but I think it is kind of a graduated process. So you do a written test, and then you have to take in-car lessons, and then some kind of in-car test. But we always joke when we're out on the weekends in particular, that when we're using the cycle tracks and certain traffic calm streets and the bicycle streets, the only cars we ever see out are from the driving schools, because the instructors are specifically taking their students to learn how to navigate with cycle traffic. So I can only imagine that that's a fairly critical part of the test, and that maybe if they don't get that part right, they may risk failing it altogether.
Yeah.
From what I understand, the success rate is going from like the medium level to having a full access license is not great from what I've been reading. So I think it's a lot of repeated tests to make sure, you're getting it right and you're going to be safe when you're out on those roads. Again, still room for error, and it does happen here, but at least the testing is doing its best.
But the driving, I mean, people drive in the Netherlands. I think we saw that in the, some folks who saw your tour said, "Oh, wow, those are really big empty streets. When were you recording this?" And others were like, "Wow, there are a lot more cars than I was expecting to see." And that was my reaction. I think I talked about the pickup truck, but I mean, there were big intersections, and I think that we got to do something with that to really showcase that. But I mean, people drive in the Netherlands. I mean, right? I mean, it's a thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we emphasize the rate of car ownership is the same as most European countries.
A lot of Dutch people really like to drive. They just don't necessarily do it for all trips, but I've had a number of people that I've met over the years saying, I really actually do like driving.
We see them washing their cars out on the street and babying them. It's just part of the mobility mix, and people choose the right tool for the right job. And
right.
To us, again, that's another no-brainer. It's like we've just built a monopoly for one mode of transport instead of giving people choices. And we're not here to tell you that cars are bad and cars should be banned. And we're trying to make car-free cities, and cycling, everything should be done by bicycle. It's this more balanced approach between walking, cycling, public transportation, and the private automobile can certainly coexist with just really modest reallocations of space, and often that nuanced argument gets lost in the
cars versus bikes.
I think that's really true, and I think it's easy to overcorrect or to I think in the US it would, if we were showcasing the Netherlands, you might lose some people by talking about the Netherlands because they would think immediately, well, they don't have cars there, and it's totally different, and they're different people, and their culture is totally different. Which, I mean, some of this stuff is true, but I think the pitting against these two things, it's better to frame it in the way you did, which is that there just aren't good choices, right? And so it is a monopoly. And if you want to put it in the sort of, into those sort of free market terms, right? There really aren't enough options for people to make a good choice. And I know that that's true in the United States. And of course, trip distance is always a factor. And, the way transit integrates with bicycling in the Netherlands it was really interesting. I think to me, to learn a little bit about that. I think, could you tell us, like, is that, how many people are doing that bike transit? Like what, how common is that to do the bike transit trip? I mean, you see these full bike parking stations like in Utrecht and you showed it in Delft. How common is that? Is that like everybody is, riding their bikes to transit and making those integrations?
I think pre-COVID, the number was 50%. 50% of all train journeys
start with a bicycle ride. So it's 1.2 million train journeys a day. So 600,000 bicycle rides to start their journey. And then on the other end of their trip, I think it's about 20%. So 200,000 or 300,000 bicycle rides. I mean, it's astonishingly common, and the more recent stat we heard was that a quarter of all kilometers cycled in Dutch cities are to or from public transportation. So that's a fourth of all cycling that's done in the cities is to get to or from a train, bus, or tram, and that's quite astonishing when you think about it. That virtuous circle exists between the two modes of transport that creates more cycling and creates more public transport users. And I mean, to me, they've just hit the sweet spot and really found a way to increase both simultaneously. But I mean, in our research, it was not purposeful. It was almost a bit of an accident, at least going into the 1990s. And then from there, they kind of discovered they were onto something and started building more bike parking and trying to stimulate that relationship. But up until that point, it was a total fluke in a lot of cases.
All right. Yeah. Transit in the US, I mean, there's some really great transit. Like rail, obviously, is good in a number of cities in the US. But, you know, most transit for folks in the US is buses, right? And what's the integration with buses and biking in the Netherlands? Is there anything there like that we could learn from you all?
I think it's a similar mindset to the trains and trams. So most of the bus hubs well, they're usually around a train station, let's be honest. But even at more populous routes, you'll see bike storage, not necessarily the same parking garages, but just like racks near transit stops to allow for that marriage of trips together. Yeah, I think because train travel is so prolific in this country, it's hard for us to see. I don't always see the bus bike relationship, but that is what should be noted. I don't think we have any bike buses here.
What, in terms of putting the bike on the bus?
So there was that accommodation for having a place to store your bike before you get on the bus. But I wouldn't, I'd be remiss to speak about what it's like in more rural areas. I know what it's like here in Delft, but.
Well, you sometimes see the secure bike parking at bus stops in the little villages and towns on the outskirts of the city. The bus routes that obviously feed people into the city center, but I don't think it's nearly as utilized as the bike train combination. Because if people are just going to cycle to the bus stop, then they may just cycle, you know, that extra 2 or 3 kilometers to get into the city anyways. So in that ways, cycling and bus travel may be a bit more competitive than the more regional and intercity trains that are traveling 20, 50, 100 kilometers in and between cities.
Yeah.
The bike sharing integration. So you have a really great bike share system that's like a national bike share system. Am I right?
That's correct. Yeah. So the OV Fiets is run by, is it NS or ProRail?
Yes.
By the National Rail. So basically they make sure that there's bikes at almost every single train station. That some of the smaller ones may not. And so anyone that has the coveted yellow OV chip card can tap in, tap out in terms of transit, but then also tap to take a bike, and you have it for, I think it's up to €4.15 now, it just went up. So for 24 hours for €4.15, you can take that bike wherever you want and just return it back to the station to take you back home again. It's really, really great for residents, which is what bike share should be for anyways. But you know, as when you're coming here to visit, you have to have a residence card in order to get an OV chip card to get the OV fee. But it makes that trip from the station to where you want to go and back again even more convenient. And now we're seeing extensions of that in terms of pilot projects, looking at, I always forget the way to describe it, but essentially bikes that live at the station and it's like a subscription service. So you pay a monthly fee and the bike will always be there for you at your arrival station to get you to where you need to go. And then you, as someone who lives in a city, you can use that as your bike to get home and then back to the station in the morning. So essentially creating a bit of a continuous trip where one person brings it, another person takes that bike out and vice versa. So the bikes are constantly moving. And it's a way to have that bike share, but also a way to help solve some of the parking problems in those massively overstocked bike parking facilities at train
the integration is really interesting. Just the way that they've made it easy to pay, but it's good to know. Thanks for the tip. As a tourist, if any of us ever go, it's not going to be the same experience. It's neat. It's neat the idea of having those sort of trip extenders on both sides of a transit trip, which I think lots of applications of that, and lots of really great stuff going on with both bike share and transit in the U.S. and obviously a lot to learn. I just want to finish up. There's some questions about just enforcement. We've talked a lot about self-enforcing streets. Just want to say, is there distracted driving came up in some of the questions. What is the Dutch approach to enforcing that? Distracted driving, drunk driving, things like that.
That's a great question.
Yeah,
maybe out of your knowledge area.
Yeah, and anecdotally, we certainly haven't seen a lot of traffic stops. Or my understanding is there is some automated enforcement, so camera-based systems, especially on the motorways, that don't just target distracted driving, but also speeding and average speed. So they will clock your arrival at a certain point and then clock your arrival 2 or 3 kilometers down the motorway. And if the time between your travel of those 2 points points to an average speed that's above the speed limit, 110, 120 kilometers an hour, more than it should be, then you will get your license plate shot and a fine sent in the mail. So it's not just a spot check of what one speed you're doing at one given point, but your average speed over a certain corridor, which I think is a really smart way. And we've seen that in Australia, is done on the highways and motorways as well.
Yeah.
I other than that,
it's not like there aren't like that you've seen. Again, I realize that you can't know everything about what's going on in the Netherlands, and I think our viewers, that ask these questions understand that too. So that's totally fine. But just so you're not seeing like traffic sting operations where there are law enforcement out and doing speed checks, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the whole the phenomenon of seeing like a police car sitting at the side of a highway road with their radar gun out. I've not seen that, but then again, I don't drive, so
sure.
I don't know for sure.
I think they've figured out that the police have more important things to do.
Right.
This idea that the police should be enforcing traffic is maybe a relatively new one, and I don't know. Yeah, they've discovered that the design of the street is much more return on investment in terms of the value, and a more impactful way to improve road safety.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an important message that, we have to continue to drive home here, and we thank you for your example of that. The streets that are the biggest determinant of people's behavior, and the way things are designed, and all the things we've talked about. I guess last question, a fun one. So Melissa, I know you were injured recently. Somebody asked, how did your leg heal so quickly? Is it all the biking that you're doing? Like, what's going on? Is biking really the fountain of youth?
My leg is not healed.
Oh no.
I think for the video, when we did the initial recording of the tour, I had a cast on, but I put my tights over it, so it was incognito. And then before the session, I had surgery and so I didn't have a cast anymore. So I'm still actually not able to cycle or walk. But Chris has been doing a fabulous job of taking me around in a bakfiets that we've borrowed from somebody here in the Netherlands, in Delft. But I look forward to getting back on my bike because having sprained this same ankle that has now been broken several times in the last 20 years or so as an adult, I know that cycling is the easiest way for me to get around and a lot less work than walking. So I look forward to being able to do that.
And cycling was specifically mentioned by the doctor as a low stress way to regain strength in your ankle once you start rehabilitating it.
Yeah.
Right. So
I don't think it's keeping me physically any younger, the cycling, but
But I think it's an important point that for
Yeah.
a lot of people, cycling is easier than walking, and especially if they have joint issues, or we often hear it referred to as a rolling walking stick, the bicycle, which I think is really a poetic way of putting it. But we should be doing all that we can to help those people get from A to B, and not assume that everybody who cycles is able-bodied, because they certainly aren't.
Yeah. And then also remember that sometimes people can't cycle either. And so making walking great is more important.
Yeah, absolutely. Any final thoughts? Any parting sort of words of encouragement for folks here in the US?
No, I mean, we specifically shaped this tour, the streets we visited, the messages that we told, to emphasize that the Netherlands is not this fairy tale. This is not a this car-free utopia. It's not this foreign. Well, it is a foreign country, but it's not. It's not this foreign concept. It's a country that put together a set of principles and a national policy 23 years ago, and is now reaping the rewards. And there's no reason that any other country in the world can't take those principles and say, we'll have some of that. We'll adapt them and adjust them for our context, of course, but and there's no reason we couldn't be visiting the US in 2040 with some similar amazing cycling infrastructure and places for people to live.
Yeah. And I think just to add to that, one of the reasons that, through our conversations with the League of American Cyclists and the embassy, that we wanted to look outside of the historic center, as beautiful and wonderful as it would have been to do a tour there, is because there is this huge opportunity in the residential neighborhoods of any city, but American cities in this context, to make small adaptations to create these more people-friendly environments. So we don't have to shoot for the moon and go for these big infrastructure, expensive projects in city centers and big cities. We can make the difference at our neighborhood level and make, just our everyday trips and our quality of life where we live and spend most of our time even better. Just, we're taking a bit of inspiration.
With some planter boxes and pylons and
a little bit of paint.
It can be that quick, cheap, and simple.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Well, thanks for taking the time to really shape this session, and with those things in mind, and continuing to be an inspiration for us who are following you on social media and seeing your work, and hopefully seeing some of that come to life in our town. So really appreciate you doing the tour and taking that time, and then taking the time today to answer the rest of these questions, and looking forward to our next time together.
Sounds good. Thanks for having us again.
It was our pleasure.